Welcome. We're going to be talking about the last 2,000 years of Egyptian history. This is not the period for which most outside tourists go to Egypt. They go to see the antiquities of the pharaohs, the Great Temple of Karnak, the Valley of the Kings, Abu Simbel, the pyramids of Giza. But nevertheless, there are things from this period that you will be seeing and that are, important for you to know the background of. So, I want to talk briefly just about Egypt as a whole. You already know this probably, but the ancient historian Herodotus described Egypt as the gift of the Nile. And if you look at it, you can see that's really true. Egypt, shown there in the light brown on that map, is a pretty large area, but most of it is uninhabited. And the settlements are along the Nile River. The vast majority of the population lives in the Nile Valley or in Cairo, right at the end of the Nile Valley, and then in the Delta. And the Greek word delta, which in the capital form, the letter delta is the shape of a pyramid or a triangle. This is the original delta. It's a delta that's inverted. Cairo is at the apex, the point of the triangle. And then the Nile splits into branches and enters the Mediterranean there. And I'll be talking about the significance of the location of Cairo later on when we talk about its founding. By Middle Eastern standards, Cairo is a fairly new city. The last lecture, I believe, left off with the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. 31 BC in September, you have the massive defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, at the Battle of Actium. And then in 30 BC, Cleopatra dies. You may remember the story of her committing suicide with the use of a poisonous asp, a poisonous snake. But the Ptolemaic dynasty did, and by the way, that image there is totally inaccurate. It's not the way it really looked, but, what the heck. We had no photographers there at 31 BC. But the Ptolemies left behind certain important things. So, for example, among them, the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae, which our tour will be visiting. It's one of the more spectacular sites in Egypt. It's a relatively late temple, so stemming basically from the Ptolemaic period, but a very interesting and very beautiful, very photogenic place. One of the details you'll see there, just thrown in for no particular reason, is these columns headed with columns with capitals of the goddess Hathor. Okay, so this is the Egypt that Augustus Caesar inherits. This is the period of Roman rule, and Egypt becomes the personal possession of the pharaoh, who is now Augustus Caesar and his successors. Egypt was deemed to be too important to be handed out to the Senate. Augustus claimed to be just first among equals in the rule of Rome, but he was not fool enough to let the Senate control Egypt. Egypt was his. Why was it so important? Because of Egypt's rich agricultural fertility. The Nile Valley was incredibly fertile with the annual deposits of Nile mud, and they could get sometimes 2 crops a year out of those fields. And if you're running an empire that is based, certainly in Rome, on giving the masses bread and circuses to keep them happy. Well, the circuses were one thing. You provide gladiatorial entertainment and that kind of thing, and they're deliriously happy. But if you're going to provide them with bread, you need grain. And that came from Egypt. So Egypt became the granary of the Roman Empire. It's said that 5 million bushels of grain came annually to Rome itself. So important was it that in 27 BC, senators were forbidden to land in Egypt without the emperor's express permission. He did not want them going there and fomenting any trouble. But even after Rome took power over Egypt, Greek, which had come in with Alexander earlier in the last lecture, Greek remained the language of the urban elite. It never became a Latin-speaking area. Greek was the language of the elite in Egypt, in Alexandria, and a few other places, until basically the 8th century when Arabic replaced it. Alexandria continued its role as the intellectual capital of Egypt, but not only of Egypt, in some ways the intellectual capital after the decline of Athens of the Roman Empire. Rome never really took on that role. Alexandria held it. It was the place where the famous museum, in Greek the Museion, the place of the muses, was. Now the museum was not just a museum, and it wasn't just a library, although the very famous Library of Alexandria was a part of the museum. The Museion or museum was a university. In some ways, not quite comparable to our universities today. Most people date the origin of the university much later. But it was similar in some ways. And it had some very important names who taught there. For example, a man by the name of Ptolemy, beginning with a P, P-T, Ptolemy, who is an important geographer, but probably best known in the West as an astronomer. The heliocentric system of the cosmos, the geocentric system of the cosmos, with the Earth at its center, that reaches its final state in Ptolemy's Almagest. By the way, is not the actual name of the book; it's an Arabic form of the name. But that was a very important book, and it lasted it was in power in the world of astronomy really until Copernicus demonstrated that the sun really was the center of the solar system. Another really important person and associated with the Museion is a man by the name of Philo Judaeus, Philo the Jew, or Philo of Alexandria. But he's not important as a Christian figure. He's pre-Christian, he's Jewish, rough contemporary of Jesus, actually, born a little before and died a little after. But he was a very prominent Jewish intellectual in Alexandria, and he was a Middle Platonist. That's a kind of follower of the Greek philosopher Plato. But he was also a devout Jew, but he was trying to bring the two systems together, Platonic thought and Jewish thought. And so he developed a system of understanding the scriptures which is allegorical. When the Bible talks about God having a body or indicates his finger or his hand or something like that, Philo said, well, it can't really literally be that because Platonic philosophy taught him that matter was evil. So God can't be embodied, so his finger, his hand must refer to something else. His hand refers to his power. His arm refers to his power. His eyes to his omniscience and all that. But he doesn't really have eyes or a finger or a hand. Now, Philo doesn't have real successors in Judaism for quite a while, but he will have successors in Christianity, and we'll come to that in just a while. It was in the air in Alexandria. Another important figure is a man by the name of Ammonius Saccas. He's very little known outside of specialty fields, but Neoplatonism happens to be my specialty field, so I'll mention him. Ammonius Saccas is the founder of a group, not Middle Platonism, but Neoplatonism, a later form. He's obviously Egyptian. His name Ammonius probably comes from the Egyptian name Ammon, one of the names of the gods. He's an apostate Christian, which may tell you something. I'm sort of jumping the gun here. I haven't introduced Christianity in Egypt yet, but Ammonius Saccas is an apostate Christian, and he teaches a man by the name of Plotinus. And Plotinus will be more widely considered the founder of Neoplatonism because he writes. He writes a lot. He has an enormous influence on subsequent thought, and there are still people today who consider themselves Neoplatonists. I'm fascinated with the doctrine, and I used to belong to an organization called the International Society for Neoplatonic Studies, and I'd say half the members are actual believers. They're real Neoplatonists. Or they might be Christians or Muslims or whatever, but they're Neoplatonists. Well, Philo will stand for one trend that's happening, which is Jews are coming to Egypt. We don't know exactly when they begin to come. Even the prophet Jeremiah, we know, ends up in Egypt and dies in Egypt when Jerusalem falls. He's carried off by his enemies, and he becomes a captive, a hostage there in Egypt, and dies there. So they're coming there at least that early. Egypt is a land of refuge. When Palestine is threatened by the Mesopotamians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and so on, then people flee and go to Egypt. Later on, there's a very famous case of that, and that is the Holy Family itself, Joseph and Mary and Jesus, who flee to Egypt. Now, I might mention, by the way, that Egypt is full of sites where traditionally Mary took rest under a palm tree or something like that. My bet is they didn't go far up the Nile Valley. It would have been very foreign territory to them, people that didn't speak their language, that were of a foreign religion where they couldn't live the kosher laws of Judaism. They would have gone to Alexandria, where there was a huge Jewish population. Philo represents it. It was an enormous population that actually had a whole quarter of the city to itself. And so they probably would have gone there where they would have felt comfortable and just stayed there. And they were out of the range of Herod. And then when Herod died, they could return. But I want to say something about the influx of Jews to Egypt, because we will be seeing at least one important manifestation of that, the Ben Ezra synagogue. And the Ben Ezra synagogue is important for a whole lot of reasons. It was probably built in pre-Islamic times. The building as we see it today isn't that original building, but it's famous for several reasons. One, it was the synagogue associated with Moses Maimonides, the greatest of the medieval Jewish rabbis. And he came from over in the Spanish and Moroccan area, but eventually ended up in Egypt and became the official physician. He was a physician as well as a rabbi and a philosopher, official physician to some of the leading Muslim rulers of Egypt. He is so great in Jewish circles. Wrote a great book called The Guide of the Perplexed and the Mishneh Torah, the second giving of the Torah. So he's esteemed as a philosopher and as a rabbi. That there's a Jewish saying about Moses Maimonides, that from Moses to Moses, there's been no one like Moses. So I remember mentioning once that I had read Maimonides in the original Arabic, because he wrote in Arabic. And a Jewish fellow that I was talking to just got emotional. Oh, how wonderful it would be to read Maimonides in the original Arabic. I can only read him in Hebrew translation. I said, well, it's really not that great an experience. It's okay, but I wouldn't get emotional about it. But the Ben Ezra synagogue, which we've shown here in the exterior view, is also important because of some documents that were found there. I'm sorry to say, Maimonides actually lived within probably a few hundred yards at most of this place. As I say, the greatest rabbi of the Middle Ages. So we'll go inside if all goes well. And in the building was a place called the Geniza. It's related to an Arabic word that means treasury or something like that, or treasure. And the Geniza, let me give you an idea of the background of a Geniza. The idea was in Judaism that you just can't throw away a Torah scroll when it becomes old or soiled or worn out or something like that. So you put it in a place with other important documents, other Torah scrolls, where it can rest. But then the idea grew up that they would put all important documents there. It became sort of a storehouse of community important documents, land deeds and contracts and wills and things like that. And the Geniza was attached to a part of this Ben Ezra synagogue. And so some great discoveries were made there. The Cairo Geniza documents really became important in the late 19th century, where people began to realize, Solomon Schechter at Cambridge and others, that this was a marvelous treasure trove of documents about what medieval Jewish life was like in Cairo. Because you could go to the house of Jewish people, still standing there, and you could read the documents. You knew how much the house cost, how much the annual budget of the house was, how many servants it had, because those documents were stored in the Geniza. We rarely have this kind of detailed information about life from the ancient or medieval Near East, but we have it for this because of the Geniza. But other documents were hidden there too. There's one famous one called the Damascus document, which nobody knew what to make of. It's called the Damascus document because it mentioned Damascus a lot. It's a kind of symbol, I think, of the world and so on. But the Damascus document, when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1948, people realized this apparently was a transcript of one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, something from the Dead Sea. How it got to Egypt, we don't really know, but it's an interesting thing. Okay, but now let's talk about Christianity coming to Egypt. Christianity comes to Egypt sometime around 33 of the Christian era, 33 AD, and by the 4th century it had largely displaced the pagan religion of Egypt. How did it come? We don't really know. The traditional Christian legend is that it came via Saint Mark, Mark the evangelist, the author of the Gospel of Mark, the great cathedral of the Coptic Church, which we'll probably see from one of the elevated roads in Cairo, more than once maybe, is called the Cathedral of Saint Mark. And so Saint Mark is really important. Now others have said, no, he didn't really come. It's something else, but we don't really know what. A friend of mine has argued that it's probably St. Mark for this reason. It's an interesting argument. He says, look, all the ancient churches after the death of the apostles were vying with one another to try to be more important than the other. Well, Rome really came out on top in a way because they claimed to have been founded by St. Peter. And then St. Paul came, and both of them died in Rome. That gave them enormous prestige. The best Egypt could do was St. Mark. And some people have said, well, it probably was St. Mark, because if they were just making it up, they would have come up with a bigger name. But St. Mark is the best they can do. And so it may well have been St. Mark, but we don't really have any clear sense of what Egyptian Christianity was like for the first couple of centuries. It may have come in or soon arose in very heretical forms. A lot of the great Gnostic heretics of the 2nd and 3rd century were there in Egypt, in Alexandria, or elsewhere. Basilides, Valentinus, Carpocrates, names that many people don't know, but they were important early heretics. And the Nag Hammadi Library, one of the most important finds of archaeology in the 20th century, found in 1946 in Central Egypt. Those documents were probably originally written in Greek and in Alexandria in the 1st century. So a lot of that was going on there. Christianity swims into the historical view around 180 AD with the ordination of Patriarch Demetrius I, who is the 12th patriarch. The first 11 are quasi-legendary figures. And so he's the first one that comes into clear historical view. This is also roughly the time of the founding of the University of Alexandria, the Christian one, the Didaskaleion, which is a really important Christian school. And in my view, one of the great engines of the apostasy, because they pick up the thought of people like Philo and they apply it to the scriptures. So two of the most important characters are Origen and Clement of Alexandria. Clement is the elder of the two, and then comes Origen. Now, conspicuously, they are not saints because they're considered to be slightly heretical by the standards of subsequent Christianity. But they apply Platonism to Christianity. They follow, especially Origen, Philo's technique of allegorical interpretation and so on. Now, that isn't to say that they're entirely heretics from our point of view. Origen, for example, taught a doctrine of human premortal existence, which is later condemned as a heresy. We would say, well, on that point at least, he was right. He was getting it correct. But this is not appreciated in Christianity, so he's never been regarded as a saint. They were regarded, though, as great scholars, and still are, as some of the pivotal figures in early Christian thought. Another development that happened in Christianity in Egypt that's really, really important for subsequent history is the development of monasticism. And so the oldest monastery in Egypt is the monastery of St. Anthony, which is out in the eastern desert. St. Anthony he wanted to be a hermit. He wanted to go out into the Egyptian desert and do battle with Satan on his own. He wanted to live in a cave and live a holy life. Seems to me that one way you can explain this is that as Christianity became more accepted with the rise of Constantine, the acceptance of Christianity, some people had to go out of the way to show they were really, really serious Christians. So it wasn't enough to just be a good person in the city. You had to go out into the desert and do heroic battle with the devil and all that kind of thing. Well, St. Anthony developed such a reputation for holiness that other people came out and joined him. They sat at the base of the mountain where his cave was. Eventually, he had to start regulating and ruling the community, exactly the kind of thing he'd gone out in the desert to escape. So he couldn't get away from it. Let me tell you, I've been out to St. Anthony's Monastery. It is way out in the desert. I grew up in Los Angeles and drove between Los Angeles and Utah quite a bit during my life growing up. And the desert between here and Los Angeles is like a tropical rainforest compared to the deserts from the Nile Valley to the Monastery of St. Anthony. Went out there with a friend once, and we even had a flat tire out in the middle of nowhere. We had not seen a village, a person, a car for several hours. There's just nothing out there until you get to the monastery. It's very isolated, but it didn't save St. Anthony. He became the founder of Christian monasticism, which then began to spread when Constantine proclaimed religious freedom in the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. Christianity spread. A lot of people joined who probably weren't very serious Christians, but they knew that the emperor liked Christianity, so better join, get there where my bread is buttered. So more and more people turned to monasticism to become monks, and to a certain extent nuns, in order to show that they were really serious about this. They weren't Christians just for social advancement and status and prestige. And so monasticism spreads, and the monks get so uppity that later on in that century, the late 4th century, the late 300s, with the support of Theodosius, the emperor in Constantinople, the monks actually begin to persecute the pagans. And so you have the assassination of Hypatia, one of the great late pagan Neoplatonic philosophers, a woman, by the way. And you have the Serapion in Alexandria being destroyed by a mob of monks. And they even converted some of the ancient Egyptian temples into churches, which may, in a sense, have had a good effect because they didn't destroy them. They just put crosses in them, but they didn't destroy them. So we still have them, mangled, but at least they exist. So a mixed blessing, I suppose. Well, at a certain point, Egypt ceases to be under the Roman Empire and comes to be under the Byzantine Empire. What does that mean? It doesn't mean a whole lot as far as Egypt goes. The Roman emperor for years had stayed out of Rome. The Senate was irrelevant. It had no power. The emperor ruled as an autocrat, and he spent most of his time, from Marcus Aurelius on, out on the battlefield, fighting the Germanic tribes up in the north, out in Spain. When Constantine is proclaimed emperor, it doesn't happen in Rome. He's off with his father, who is the co-emperor of the time, and Constantine is proclaimed emperor in York, in England. So he's nowhere near Rome. Rome is irrelevant. It's becoming a backwater. And then the focus of his battles shifts from the Germanic tribes over to the east, to the Persian Empire, which is always the hereditary foe of Rome. And so he decides his capital needs to be closer to them. And he chooses a little village called Byzantium, which then he knows as Neo Roma, New Rome, because it had 7 hills, just like Rome had 7 hills. And eventually it comes to be called the city of Constantine, or Constantinople. Polis, Greek polis, city, Constantine, Constantinople. And then, of course, later on, when the Turks conquer it in 1453, it becomes Istanbul. Still one of the great cities, one of my favorite places on the planet. Absolutely love Istanbul. So it doesn't make too many changes, except that the empire has become Christian now, and it cares about what's going on in Christianity after Constantine. So now I'll say something about the languages really quickly. Egyptian still survives as a language. It's taken on a different form. It's begun to adopt the Greek alphabet. The hieroglyphic form was unwieldy, so they use a modified Greek alphabet and write it, and it's called Coptic, which is after the word Aegyptos, Egypt, right? That is spoken in the countryside, probably throughout much of the country. In the urban areas, among the elite, though, Greek is the language since the days of Alexander that is being spoken. And so a lot of Christian writing comes out of Egypt in Greek, as well as in Coptic. That leads to 2 really important figures who have an enormous influence on the history of Christianity thereafter. St. Athanasius, who died about AD 73, and a man by the name of Arius, who is conspicuously not recognized as a saint, because these were arch enemies. And at the Council of Nicaea, Arius, who was a priest of Alexandria, you see him there with the sort of turban on. That's probably not how he looked, but anyway, we do our best. Arius proclaims his doctrine that Christ was not consubstantial with the Father. That is, they're not of the same essence. They're not of the same substance. Christ is a created being, a lower being than the Father. Athanasius, who is also an authority in the church in Alexandria, and who will become the patriarch of Alexandria and a saint, considered one of the great saints of the Christian church. Athanasius will argue that no, the Father and the Son are of the same substance. You may have heard about this in the Nicene Creed, the famous debate about whether they are homoiousion or homoousion. Homoi meaning plural, just the difference of an iota, meaning that they're of similar substance but not the same, versus Athanasius' insistence that they are the same substance. Now, we normally think, Latter-day Saints, I think, that, well, Arius was right. I mean, Christ is the Son, not the Father. He's subordinate to the Father. But let me tell you something about that battle over whether Christ was of the same substance or a different substance. Athanasius was arguing for it for a very interesting reason, which should resonate with Latter-day Saints and ought to cause discomfort for those who are from the Nicene Creed. Because Athanasius said that he needed Jesus to be fully divine, because only by Jesus being fully divine could humans be deified. Athanasius is linked with a statement that says, God became man so that man could become God. So there is God, the Father, who's wholly divine. There is humanity, which is wholly human. Christ is the bridge. He's both human and divine. He's of the same substance with the Father, but he is also human. Therefore, he's the bridge by which, if we accept him, we can cross over from humanity into deity and become deified. That's something that proponents of the Nicene Creed don't often think about, but it's actually a more, if you will, a more consistent doctrine with Latter-day Saints than with our critics. But Arius was condemned at the Council of Nicaea, and it wasn't always done in the most peaceful way. There is Arius on the left, and the man who's punching him is not Athanasius, although Athanasius was his chief enemy there. This man is, believe it or not, St. Nicholas of Myra. Now, St. Nicholas of Myra is the original, the prototype of Santa Claus. St. Nick. Jolly old St. Nick. There he is. This really happened. He walked up to Arius on the floor of the council. At one point, he was so sick of hearing Arius speak that he walked up and he decked him, according to some accounts. Just clobbered him with a right to the jaw. You know, a right jolly old elf. So a little different than our standard image of St. Nicholas. But that council is really important because from it comes the Nicene Creed, which is the basis of modern doctrines of the Trinity. It's a very interesting argument. Now, the arguments didn't stop there. I mean, these councils were raucous affairs. Often they didn't decide things by vote, they decided things by acclamation. So it'd literally be cheerleaders down on the floor, getting their side to yell louder so that they could decide that the affirmative had it, you know, because they out-yelled the negative or something like that. And there were battles, literal battles, and Arius probably died by assassination. People said it was a miracle. He was walking down the street one day. Suddenly he just collapsed and died. And to me it sounds like poisoning. A lot of scholars think that's what it was. But in the 5th century, the 400s, there was another dispute, a Christological controversy. We'll leave this slide up just for a minute because it kind of gives the feeling of these controversies. Nestorius, the bishop of Constantinople, argued that there were two natures in Jesus, the human and the divine. Alexandria had come to the conclusion that there was only one nature. It was a mingling of the human and the divine. So they were called Monophysites, from the Greek meaning one nature. But Nestorius in Constantinople was a duophysite, two natures. They argued about this and it's not only a theological rivalry. I think what it shows you is a rivalry between Constantinople, the newly founded capital of the empire, and Alexandria, which was the other great city of the empire, which saw itself as older and classier and couldn't see why it should bend the knee to Constantinople. So there are political things going on here as well as theological things. You might see it in the rivalry between, I don't know, San Francisco and Los Angeles, or I'm told Sydney, the brash upstart city, and Melbourne, the older, swanker, classier city, at least as it sees itself. So the arguments are not always just about theology. They're about, you know, local pride and that sort of thing. Well, it gets to be so bad that Egypt is feeling oppressed. But we will see one element of Christianity in Egypt, at least one, and that is the St. Sergius Church, or St. Sergius and Bacchus. in Coptic Cairo in Egypt, which is not very far from the Ben Ezra synagogue. We'll probably see them together. This is the old part of Cairo. At the time, just before the arrival of the Muslims, the Patriarch Theodosius I of the Christian church in Egypt is in exile at St. Macarius Monastery out in the West Desert, a place that I've been to many times, though not recently. But he's out there in exile because he's being harassed by Byzantine officials coming in from the outside. The church in Egypt is frankly in revolt against Byzantine rule. But it has left behind a lot of really wonderful buildings. We'll go, I think, to St. Sergius. We may go to the Mamluk, or a hanging church. And they're wonderful old places commemorating very old practices. Egypt was, for a long time, before the arrival of the Muslims and for several centuries thereafter, majority Christian. So the thing was so bad, the situation was so bad, that in 619 AD, when the Persians arrived for a brief conquest of Egypt, they were regarded as liberators. And then a few decades later, in 641, 642, thereabouts, the Arabs invade Egypt. And this is an amazing story in itself, just that this little group of Bedouin Arabs basically conquer Egypt. Well, part of the reason was that Egypt was ready to be conquered. They wanted to be separated from the Byzantine Empire. They didn't like them. And the story goes that there was actually an Egyptian Christian who went down to a gate in Old Cairo, right there by Ben Ezra and by St. Sergius Church, and opened the gate of the fortress to allow the Muslims in, on the reasoning they couldn't be any worse than the Byzantines were, and they might be better, which in fact they probably were, because they didn't care about squabbling Christian sects, all the same to them. So the Egyptians were no longer persecuted in the same way. Now we will see one building related to that Egyptian conquest, and that is a building called the Mosque of Amr ibn al-As. There you see the entrance to the mosque, and above it, by the way, in Arabic it says Allahu Akbar. You've heard that phrase. And this is the interior. Now I want to say that the mosque is the oldest building in the Muslim world, the oldest Muslim building in the Muslim world. But only a part of it is original. Most of it is fairly modern. We will possibly walk by the one corner, it's only a few feet square, that is absolutely authentic and goes back to the original structure, founded right after the Arab conquest. The oldest standing Islamic building still intact and almost entirely intact, original, is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So that was built in the 690s, the early 690s. But this building is actually older, but it only survives in a few square feet. So I think we have to give the palm or the honor to the Dome of the Rock. Now, there will be a succession of dynasties that wash over Egypt during this time, but none of them is in Egypt until the one I'll tell you about. You have the Umayyads, who come to power right after Muhammad dies. They rule the whole empire from Damascus. Egypt is an important province for them, but their center of power is in Damascus. Then they are overthrown in a spectacular way, lots of stories to tell, but we don't have time to tell them, by a group called the Abbasids, whose center of power is further to the east. So they found a new capital city, very new by the standards of the Middle East, called Baghdad. And so that becomes a really important city, a capital of the entire Islamic empire from, well, the Umayyads went from Spain almost to India. They lose Spain, the Umayyads keep it. The Abbasids control everything else all the way over to and including northern India. So it's a huge empire, and they control Egypt as well. But the empire begins to decay, partly by reason, I would suggest, of sheer size. It's so big that communications are really, really hard. You know, by the time the caliph in Baghdad hears of a problem, say a report is sent to him of a problem way off in, let's make it Morocco, it may have been 2 or 3 months since the message was sent. Then he gets it, it's 2 or 3 months old, who knows what the current situation is. He has to formulate a response and send it back, which may take an additional 2 or 3 months. And so the empire just simply begins to fall apart in this sense, that local authorities, local governors, are having to make their own decisions. They can't wait for guidance from Baghdad. They can't just send an email or get the caliph on the phone. And so the emperors begin, or the governors begin to take their own initiative. And I want to talk about the one who really does this. There's a man by the name of Ahmed ibn Tulun. And this is a mosque that he built, which is still standing in Cairo. One of my favorite places. I don't think we'll get there, but you can see in the inset photograph that it's a huge courtyard mosque. One of the things I love about it is, A, that it's still intact, B, that for all the chaos and noise and bustle of Cairo outside, when you step in through the doubled walls of this thing, it's serene. It's absolutely quiet. And it's a large area because he was governor of Egypt, and he wanted a place where he could review his troops, a public space. So that's one of the uses that he put it to. Marvelous building, still very much worth a visit when people have the time to do it. But I want to talk about Ahmed ibn Tulun for another reason. Ibn Tulun was a very powerful governor of Egypt, and he began to harbor the desire that his son would succeed him as governor of Egypt. So he sent a message to the caliph in Baghdad. And he said, I would like permission for my son to be the new governor after I die. Now the caliph is faced with a dilemma at this point. What should he do? If he ratifies the right of a governor of Egypt to name his own successor, then he's lost control over who the governor of the provinces will be. Not only in Egypt, but the other governors are quickly going to demand the same privilege. On the other hand, if he says no, Ibn Tulun, who owns one of the richest provinces in the empire, with all the grain and the crops of Egypt and the huge standing army, maybe the largest of all the provinces, he may just say, well, okay, without your permission, I'm going to do it anyway. I declare independence. So, in effect, the caliph is forced. He acknowledges Ibn Tulun's right to name his successor, and Egypt becomes, in a sense, de facto independent with that. The governor of Egypt can do what he wants to do. Well, then there's more history after that. Another dynasty comes along called the Fatimids. They're actually my focus as a student of Islam. The Fatimids were founded in 909 out in Tunisia. They were a Shiite group whose goal was to conquer the whole empire. They claimed their authority by right of the descent of their leader from the Prophet Muhammad through Ali, his son-in-law, and Fatima, his daughter. And that was their claim to authority. Their goal was to conquer the whole empire. They began moving eastward. They did conquer Egypt. They conquered Syria, basically today's Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. They never quite made it to Baghdad. But there's a fun story about them. The story is told of when they invaded Egypt, a delegation of religious authorities went out and said, okay, by what right do you claim to rule Egypt? Well, the Sultan said, I claim the right because I am a descendant of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima, hence the name Fatimiyin, the Fatimids. And these religious authorities said, well, so what is the proof that you have that you're a descendant of Fatima and Muhammad? And he is said to have pulled his scimitar out and held it in front of them, his very sharp sword. And he said, this is my proof. And the record says that they were all completely convinced. Just, okay, you must be a descendant of Fatima and the Prophet Muhammad. So, but the Fatimids are really important because they found the city of Cairo. The capital of Egypt had at various points been around in that area. We'll go to the site of ancient Memphis. The great pyramids are built there because Memphis was the capital and they're on the opposite side of the river. But it's important, the Fatimids build a new city there. They want a new city. They build it to the north of the original Islamic settlement, Fustat. And why do they want it there? That's an interesting question. Why do they name it what they name it? It's founded in 969, and they call it Cairo because on the day that they establish it and do this sort of ribbon cutting, the planet Mars is in the ascendant in terms of astrology. Now, this is really odd to have this named astrologically because Muslims typically haven't been associated with astrology, but the Fatimids took it seriously. Pre-modern people did. And Mars was known as Al-Qahir, the victorious. And so in honor of Mars, Cairo is called Al-Qahira, Al-Medina Al-Qahira, the victorious city. So Al-Qahira is the Arabic form of the name Cairo. It's been anglicized to Cairo. Why would they want that city to be where it was? Well, if you look at the map, you see that, as I've said before, Cairo is at the apex of the inverted pyramid that is the Egyptian delta. And it's really importantly situated because it's far enough inland from the Mediterranean Sea that it can't easily be attacked by sea. It can't be attacked from the land because it's surrounded by desert, the Libyan desert on the west, and the Sinai and all that to the east. And this is really desert. Where it is located, it controls all trade up and down the Nile. It also controls the delta. Now, one thing you'll notice about Cairo when you go there is that the older parts of the city are far back from the Nile River. There's a very practical reason for this. Every year the Nile flooded. Now it's controlled by the dams. You couldn't build right by the river. You'd be flooded out every single year. And so they built it back. When you stand in the old city of Cairo today, up on the Citadel, for example, which we'll show you in a few minutes, and you look toward the modern city, the high-rises and so on, they are down by the river because that land became usable after the dams were put in, when the flooding was controlled. So the older part of the city is far back from the Nile River. It's up against the Muqattam Hills, about as far as they could move it away from the Nile River. They didn't want to be flooded. Okay, so I'll give you a view of medieval Cairo. This is a part of it. That's the way it looks. And there are parts of Cairo, unfortunately, they're not valued by the Egyptians very often. Egypt has seen its bread and butter in tourism, and specifically tourism to the pharaonic sites. If the Islamic sites could be cleaned up and made attractive, Cairo is an attractive medieval city too, maybe the best preserved medieval city in the world. There are whole sections of old Cairo you can walk where you will not see a building that was built after the 1400s. Everything is medieval to late medieval. This is looking at some of that. And you see some of the greenery in the background. This is what old Cairo looks like, and it tends to be really brown because the stone is brown, and every year it gets a new coating of dust. So it's a dusty city, and then broken up with some really lush green in the Nile Valley. But modern Cairo is not like this. You get down to the Nile, and you see a modern city. Now it's a modern third world city, so there will be even the occasional camel walking down the main streets. Not very often anymore, but when I first went there, you'd see them. But you see a lot of modern buildings here. And interestingly, right in the center of this scene, sort of in the back, with the revolving restaurant kind of thing on the top, that is the hotel that I believe we'll be staying in on the tour this year. So it's a really nice location. You'll be looking back at the place from which this photograph was taken. Now, when the Fatimids began to lose steam, they were overthrown by another dynasty, if dynasty is the right word for it. Yes, and it was founded by a man by the name of Saladin, or as he's often known in the West, Saladin. He was known as Saladin al-Ayyubi. Ayyub means Job. It's the biblical person Job in Arabic. And so that was part of his name. And he is considered one of the great heroes in the history of Islam. And I have to admit, he's one of my heroes because he defeated the Crusaders and he retook Jerusalem, defeated them at the great Battle of Hattin, which if you ever come with me on a tour of Israel, I'll point out to you where this happened and how Saladin did it. Brilliant victory. Absolutely destroyed the Crusaders in that battle. But he's regarded as a great hero because not only was he a great general, but he was famous for his clemency. He was a just ruler. And he died, by the way, having given away most of his possessions. Very serious, good man. So much so that he shows up as a kind of hero in Dante's Inferno. Dante's account of hell, he puts Saladin or Saladin in the highest circle of hell. That is the very best part of hell he could put him in. He couldn't put him any higher because as a medieval Christian, he couldn't allow a non-baptized person into heaven. So Saladin had to go into hell. But he's in the very highest part of hell along with Dante's heroes, Homer and the Roman poet Virgil and Plato and Aristotle and so on. That's the best he could do for him. He even shows up as a hero in a German Enlightenment play called Nathan the Wise, Nathan der Weise, where he's the model of the wise king, um, making judgment, just judgment. He's been seen that way in the West a lot, even though he was their enemy, their great enemy in the Crusades. But he founded a dynasty called the Ayyubids, and they were then succeeded by, I need to talk about the Citadel of Cairo first, yes. The most visible sign of Saladin that you'll see in Cairo is something we probably will see numerous times, and I want you to recognize it, even though we may or may not go near it, some may. And that is the Citadel of Cairo, which is on the highest point overlooking the city, and you can see it from much of the city. And here's a close-up of it, Saladin's Citadel of Cairo, his fortress that was his headquarters. And we'll come back to that, but you'll pass by it coming in and out of the city and so on. But Saladin's dynasty was overthrown eventually, not long after his death. Those who succeeded him were not of the same level of ability that he was. Something that Saladin did, though, had real implications thereafter. He began to bring in foreign soldiers, slave soldiers, from Central Asia, from initially Turkic groups, and later on they came in from Mongolian groups. And these were lean, tough military fighters. He had found that the Arabs, the Egyptians, were getting soft. You know, they were rich enough that they didn't want to go out and fight. Why should they fight? They might lose their lives, and they were rich enough they didn't want booty. So he brought in these soldiers and put them into his army, but gave them great prestige and great power. And so eventually, when his dynasty begins to peter out, it's these slave soldiers who take control in one of the oddest dynasties, if you want to call it a dynasty, that ever existed in human history. It's known as the Mamluk dynasty. And the Mamluks exist in Egypt, rule from about 1250 to 1517. It's a very definite end to the dynasty. But they were slave soldiers who would, one of them would rise to power as the new sultan. The word sultan comes from the Arabic word sulta, meaning power, which tells you pretty much how he ruled. And this new sultan would have his own Mamluks. The word in Arabic means owned or possessed, not demon-possessed, but literally possessed like a book or a car. And they would fight loyalty to him, and as they matured in his service, they would gain their own freedom. And when he died, then one of them would succeed to the rule. And so you often don't have father leaving his reign to his son, but it goes from one Mamluk to another for about 3 centuries or thereabouts. And so it's a really interesting dynasty. But much of what you'll see in Cairo today, in the older period, comes from the Mamluk dynasties. Slave soldier rule. It was very prosperous and so on. They often, though, didn't speak very good Arabic. And so where previous rulers would patronize poets and philosophers and historians, the Mamluks couldn't read that stuff. But they knew a good building when they saw one. And so they built a lot of buildings. A lot of the great medieval buildings that still stand in Cairo are of the Mamluk period. I want to go back and pick up one thing I failed to mention in connection with Saladin. He has become such a hero in the Muslim world, and for, I think, good reasons, that lots of people want to claim to be Saladin or the modern Salahuddin. One of them was Saddam Hussein. Now, the ironies there are just really clear. Salahuddin was regarded even by his Christian opponents as a good, just man. Saddam Hussein, shall we say, did not enjoy that image. But here's the thing that's really funny. Saddam Hussein, not funny, sad in a way, Saddam Hussein was famous for his terrible persecution of the Kurds in the north of Iraq. Well, ethnically, Salahuddin was a Kurd. And so I've always said, yeah, if there really were a second coming of Saladin under Saddam Hussein, I know the first person Saladin would go after, it would have been Saddam Hussein. He would not have seen himself in Saddam. But that says something, by the way, that Egypt was being ruled during this period and has been ruled for a long, long time by foreigners. It's worthy of note that really, since the Persian invasion before Christ, there were Macedonians with the Ptolemies and Romans and Byzantines and Greeks and imported governors and Mamluks and the Kurdish Saladin and so on. Egypt was not ruled by Egyptians until the 20th century again. And that's something that's worth remembering. But the Mamluks built and built and built, and one of the things they built is an area that you will see and pass by. It's not far from the citadel, called the City of the Dead. It's a huge cemetery. And many of the buildings are simple little structures, but many of them are not. If you look in the background in this image, you see these elaborate stone domes. Some of those are very famous buildings, and they're enormous cemetery or funerary complexes where the Mamluk sultans were buried. And the area, in fact, is so well built that over the past generations, it's actually filled up with people who live in these tombs now. And the government for a long time pretended they weren't there, but eventually it had to bring in plumbing and electricity because there are probably 1.5 to 2 million people, if not more, who live in the City of the Dead. It's better built than most of the apartments in Cairo. And so it's a really interesting place, and we'll see it as we pass by on one of the main roads, I suspect more than once. Now, the Mamluks raised Cairo to its great period of prosperity. You know, by now, Baghdad has been destroyed by the Mongols, and Egypt has come into its own kind of, and so Cairo becomes a really important capital city under Mamluk rule. But it faces some real challenges. So, for example, in 1347, the Black Death comes in to Egypt. It reaches Alexandria by boat from Constantinople. We think we know even which boat it was and when it came. It's the same thing that happened at various ports in Europe where people would see a boat that, gosh, it's just floating offshore, you know, what happened? And they go out and everybody on it is dead. Well, they didn't know the germ theory of disease, so bring it into the harbor, right? It's the worst thing you could possibly do. What you ought to do is burn it offshore, but they didn't know that. In 1348, the Black Death, this is an image of that. It seems appropriate right now as we're nearing Halloween, the Dance of the Dead. But it did a lot of damage in Cairo. Cairo was, cities of the Middle East tend to be more densely packed than cities in Europe historically were. And so a third of the city's 600,000 people died, probably in the course of a year, maybe even less than a year. We even have accounts of smaller cities in Egypt where people would go to bed and everything was normal. They wake up in the next morning and what we would consider the mayor, the police force, everything is dead. There's just nobody left to enforce the law. All the religious authorities, the lawyers, the judges, and so on are gone. Well, during this period of the Black Death, a really important building was built, and that is the Sultan Hassan Mosque, which we will, I believe, visit. There are two buildings actually in this scene. There's one on the right that we'll see later. The Sultan Hassan is the one on the left, and it's an enormous building built by a fairly insignificant Sultan of the Mamluk dynasty. Why did he build such a big building? Some people have been impressed that he was able to do it in a time of pandemic and poverty and death and so on. But one way he probably did it was to confiscate the estates of people who had died without leaving heirs. You know, government comes in, takes the property, he uses it to build his madrasa, his school. It was a school, a mosque, and a mausoleum. It's his mausoleum. Ironically, he's not buried in it. We don't know what happened to him. He didn't live to be very old. But it's a marvelous old mausoleum and madrasa or school. You can still sort of get an idea of how it was. People would come there on scholarships. They would study the law and so on in this building. The oldest university in the world, most people think, is probably Al-Azhar, which was founded, and I neglected to mention this, founded about the same time as Cairo itself, maybe 970 AD, the year following, by the Fatimids. They were going to use it as a propaganda center for spreading their version of Islam. Ironically, after their fall, and since then, ever since, it's become the bastion of Sunni Muslim orthodoxy, not Shiite. And so it's the foremost Islamic university in the Arab world. And we'll see it. It's not far from the City of the Dead, not too far from the Citadel. But now another big change is going to come. Another group of foreigners arrive. In 1517, Egypt is invaded by the Ottoman Turks, who rule from Istanbul, which they took in 1453, and Egypt becomes a part of the Ottoman Empire. I wanted you to see what the Ottoman Empire looks. This is more or less the Ottoman Empire at its height. The rule was from Istanbul. You can see it kind of up in the upper center of the screen there, where the Sea of Marmara, the little tiny body of water, meets the Black Sea. There's a body of water, a canal or a channel called the Bosporus that connects the two seas. I would say 2/3 of the Turkish restaurants I'm aware of in the United States are called the Bosporus. But Istanbul, as you can see, was a marvelous location. It controlled sea trade. There was a land bridge there that it controlled between Asia and Europe. Even today, part of Istanbul, Greater Istanbul, is in Asia and part is in Europe. It's a bridge between the continents. Artificial, distinction, but still important. But Istanbul is now ruling Cairo and ruling Egypt. Just want you to get a sense for how big the Ottoman Empire was. Now, it may look shallow, not very deep along the Mediterranean coast, especially in the south. That's because it's desert further in from the south. There was no point in owning that. They hadn't discovered oil yet. So the coast was all you cared about. The rest was just dead. So anyway, the Ottomans rule it. The Ottomans control Egypt for a long time. This is probably the empires that looked under Suleiman the Magnificent, maybe its greatest extent. I'm going to zip along fast now because I don't want to go on too long with this because I have some detailed stuff to do later. In 1798, there's another invasion of Egypt, and that is the invasion of Napoleon Bonaparte, who actually, the evidence indicates, was thinking of converting to Islam in order to administer his newly won Middle Eastern empire. 1798, they defeat the troops there and they take control of Egypt, but they're driven out in 1801, basically by the British. Again, it's foreigners who are determining the control of Egypt. And this is a great humiliation to the Egyptians. In 1805, nominally, there's an Ottoman rule that's kind of restored there. 1805, an Albanian gentleman by the name of Muhammad Ali, not to be confused with the boxer, establishes a dynasty that goes on as governors of Egypt for some time, eventually becoming kings in themselves. Nominally, they're part of the Ottoman Empire, but it's that old tendency of the Ottoman Empire is declining, the governors are declaring independence. The Ottoman Empire actually lasted into the 20th century. It just wouldn't die. It was called the sick man of Europe. Everyone expected it to collapse, but it didn't quite until World War I did it in. They joined the wrong side and they lost. But Muhammad Ali takes power and he builds a mosque, which we will definitely see. And that's built on top of the citadel. He wanted that to control a view of the whole city. And that's a very Ottoman-style looking mosque. You can see that the battlements are part of Saladin's citadel from centuries before. And then that mosque is built there at in the 1800s. It's a relatively modern mosque. And I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan of the thing. I think it looks all right from a distance, but I don't really like it up close. But you will see it. It's very prominently displayed from many parts of the city. We'll pass by it. I want to say something about the minarets. Notice in that mosque that it has enormous pencil-shaped minarets. That's very Turkish, very Ottoman. Okay, they're really tall, they're really thin, and they have a pencil shape at the top. But let's look at this next slide, which will give you an idea of the variety of minarets that you might see, and it's actually wider than that. The one on the left is more or less a Central Asian and Iranian style minaret. Blunt, not as tall, with blue tiles and so on. In the center, you have a very famous mosque in Turkey itself, kind of a quintessential Ottoman-style Turkish mosque with those pencil-shaped minarets. On the right, you have one. This one, ironically, happens to be actually in Damascus, but it's an Egyptian-style minaret. It was built by an Egyptian ruler, and the only difference between that and the ones you see in Egypt is that it has some color that they generally lack in Egypt itself. And so I want to say this can be very useful for you. I was asked several years ago to speak to a group in Australia of, Muslims at their mosques. The area presidency took me out to visit with them. And I asked, well, what kind of a group is this I'm going to be meeting with? Are they Arabs? Are they Pakistanis? Are they Bosnians? Are they, what nationality are they? Is it a Shiite mosque or a Sunni mosque? So I can start thinking about how I might interact with them. And they didn't know, to be honest. But as we reached the mosque, came toward the mosque, I could see looming above the trees these enormous pencil-shaped minarets, much like those. And I thought, okay, I've just settled the question. I know by seeing the minarets that it's Sunni, not Shiite, and it's Turkish, which it was. So anyway, practical knowledge. Now you know. Okay, so we'll jump ahead. In 1859 to 69, the Suez Canal was built. This is something that people had dreamed about since antiquity, linking the Indian Ocean basically with the Mediterranean, avoiding the trip around Africa, which was dangerous and long and difficult. So it was finally built. People had made attempts to do it earlier, but it hadn't worked. The Egyptians had even thought of it. But this was built by the French, and it really put Egypt on the map for a whole entirely new reason. It eventually attracted the attention of the British, for example. It made travel from the Mediterranean to India, the jewel of Queen Victoria's crown, much easier than it once had been. You could zip over to India relatively quickly. So the Suez Canal is built. But I want to tell you a little bit of amusing history related to something you will see in Egypt. A man by the name of Ismail, who was the Khedive, that was a title that was given to him at that time, not yet king, but a successor of Muhammad Ali. Khedive Ismail was the Khedive, the ruler of Egypt, nominally at least, during the period of the Suez Canal. And he was really excited that all sorts of dignitaries were coming there to visit. I mean, the opera Aida was written by Verdi in honor of this thing. It was a big deal. And so he built a palace in Cairo, which is still there. If you see that orange building, there's an orange tower on the left, and you can barely see an orange tower on the right. Those are part of the Marriott Omar Khayyam Hotel. The center part, the low part, is a palace that the Khedive Ismail built for the Empress Eugenie, who was coming there for the dedication, the opening of the Suez Canal. And Ismail had a super crazy crush on her. And so he built this palace because she was coming to stay for a few nights, just a few nights, basically a weekend. He even built 2 bedrooms in it. One bedroom was in the Egyptian Oriental style, the Middle Eastern style. But he thought, well, what if she doesn't like that? So he built another one that was as near as he could make it to her bedroom back home, so she could stay in that. And then he built a road for her from here to the Suez Canal and so on, just for her carriage, so that she could ride there. Pyramids Road is basically that too, that he wanted her to be able to see the pyramids and ride in comfort and so on. We'll be going out on Pyramids Road, and it's still a major artery today, but that was built because of a guy who just had a sort of puppy crush on this empress from Europe. Okay, some other developments that go on after this. In 1882, British troops defeat the Egyptian army and take genuine control of the country. So they're really running it, ostensibly behind the scenes, but they are running it. Still, important things are being done during this time. There's another important building that's built. I've shown you the Sultan Hassan Mosque, which was built by that Mamluk Sultan. There you see it on the left. Immediately on the right is the Rifai Mosque, which is equally large, in fact, maybe even bigger, and which is designed to sort of match it. If we have time, we'll go in there. That's a modern mosque built in 1905, but I rather like it. A lot of architectural historians hate it, but I kind of like it. I guess it shows I have no taste. By the way, you'll see a typical stone dome on this little one that's right in front of it, there to the right of the picture, and that 2-tone stone thing in the not on the dome itself, but in the building. That's very typically Mamluk. And then you're looking at it you can see it right there. You're looking at it from the Citadel of Cairo. You're up on the Citadel looking down on it. In that, in the Rifai Mosque are the tombs of the various kings of Egypt, the recent ones, starting with Ismail and Fuad and so on, up to Farouk. Also, the Shah of Iran, who died in exile in Egypt, is buried there in a really elegant green jade covered tomb. And that's an important thing for me because I was the private tutor to his daughter while he was in exile in Egypt, and I got to meet him, and then he died of cancer not long after that, and so he's buried there. Once again, Egypt was playing, and Sadat said so, playing a role as a land of refuge, a place where people who were in exile could come. In 1914, Egypt officially becomes a British protectorate. But there is still a king ruling there by the name of Fuad I, with that really neat mustache. He became the king in 1922, and then Egypt gained independence, nominal, although British influence was still really, really significant until the 1950s or even the 60s. Meanwhile, there were people in the country who didn't like all that European influence. One of them was a man by the name of Hassan al-Banna. And Hassan al-Banna was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. You may have heard of that. In 1928, he founded it. He was killed in 1949, executed. But his campaign was to reorient Egypt. He wanted the whole Muslim world to turn away from Western influence and to go back to its greatness when it was thoroughly Islamic. Another thing, and I'm just going to pick up a lot of dates now because this is getting really close to us. Eventually, it'll even come down to months. But in 1948, another important development happens when Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan and Syria attack the new state of Israel. This is the 48 War, as the Israelis call it, the War of Independence. And the Israelis have just announced a state, and the Arab forces around them say, no, that will not be, because it's on what they see as confiscated Arab land. And they have a point there. They really do have a point there. But the Egyptian army performs so poorly that it increases the unpopularity of the royal house. King Farouk at the time will show his picture. One of the things that is said is that many of the troops who were out on the front lines, well, they had rifles, but they didn't have ammunition. It's kind of hard to fight when you don't have anything to shoot. It was embarrassing. It was humiliating that this little upstart group of Zionists in Palestine are able to wrest that land away from 4 major Arab states. So there was enormous dissatisfaction throughout the country with the royal family, particularly with the king, at that time King Farouk. And especially there was discontent in the army, which has always been, in the last century at least, a really powerful influence within Egypt, as you will see in just a minute. And so a group of officers came together who called themselves the Free Officers, the Committee of the Free Officers Movement. And here you see a picture of them. They banded together to overthrow what they saw as a corrupt and incompetent monarchy, which had humiliated them in the 1948 war. And it was led by, nominally at least, it was led by a man by the name of Mohammed Naguib, General Naguib. And you can see him here in this picture. He's over to the right-hand side of the picture, looking at the camera. But there's some other really important people in this that you should also know. If you look directly to his right, left of him in the picture, there's a man looking right at the camera with a mustache. That is Gamal Abdel Nasser, who will soon succeed him. And then if you go 2 people over to his left, the darker complexioned man is Muhammad Anwar Sadat. And many of you will remember that name, of course. It's a relatively young-looking Anwar Sadat. So they, in 1952, in July of 1952, there's a free officers coup, and they overthrow King Farouk. He abdicates and eventually leaves the country, abdicates in favor of his infant son, who was named Ahmed Fuad II, but he never ruled. The person who really becomes president, really becomes the ruler, in June of 53, is Mohammed Naguib, or Najib, as sometimes people write that. The Jim letter is pronounced in Cairo like a G, a hard G, G, so Naguib. But in southern Egypt and throughout much of the rest of the Arab world, it would be Najib. They pronounce it that way. Of course, if you get to Lebanon, where the French were for a long time, it's Najib. So heavily influenced by French. He becomes the president, and Egypt is declared a republic. And he rules for about a year, and then he's displaced by the real power in the Free Officers Movement, a man by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who becomes the prime minister. In 1956, he becomes the president, and he rules unchallenged until his sudden death in 1970. So there's Gamal Abdel Nasser, and you see who he's with. On his right is Anwar Sadat, And on his left is Nikita Khrushchev. Some of you may remember that character who, pounded his shoe on the desk in the United Nations and promised that the Soviet Union would bury the United States. Well, he's long gone, by the way, just as a footnote. But I want to say something about the name Gamal Abdel Nasser and about Arabic names that might just help you make sense of the very foreign names that you run into. So here's a little excursus about names. One element that you'll see very commonly is the element abd, which means slave or servant. Sometimes you'll see it in the form of Abdel something or other, or Abdul something or other. So slave of the, which is what that means, Abdul something or other, Abdul something or other. It's an incomplete phrase. You have to complete it with something, usually a divine name. So Abdul Malik means slave of the king or servant of the king. There are lots of these. Karim Abdul Jabbar was Karim, servant of the omnipotent one. Gamal Abdel Nasser, Gamal, servant of the victorious one. The Christians will sometimes use a form of the name that's Abdul Masih, slave of the Messiah, or slave of Christ, or something like that. If you see a person named Abdul Masih, you know immediately he's Christian. Now, sometimes in the West we haven't understood this, and it's led to some pretty funny things. So, for instance, I would see on sometimes discussions of Karim Abdul Jabbar as Jabbar. Well, Jabbar means omnipotent, all-powerful. And I'll just say this. I grew up in Los Angeles. I saw Abdul Jabbar miss free throws. I saw him miss layups. You know, he was really good, but he was not all-powerful. And his team sometimes lost. Although when he was at UCLA, they almost never did. But it is improper to separate the element Abdul from what follows it. If you call someone Masih, you're calling him the Messiah. His last name is actually Abdul Masih, slave of the Messiah. If you call Gamal Abdel Nasser, his first name means something like beautiful or beauty. Abdel Nasser means slave of the victorious one. Well, if you know Abdel Nasser's military record, he didn't actually do very well against Israel historically. So to call him Nasser, the victorious one, is kind of ironic. Now this can, again, I want to point out practical things that can help you. There was a sting operation that was conducted, I don't remember what year it was, early 70s maybe, called Abscam, in which several congressmen and a senator from New Jersey were captured taking bribes from an FBI agent who was masquerading as an Arab sheikh, right? And he was representing something called Abdul Enterprises. Now right there, here's where a knowledge of how these names work can help you. No Arab would have ever fallen for that, because he would have said Abdul what? You know, you can't just call it Abdul something, you know? It means slave of the enterprises? What does that make? That doesn't make any sense. So you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? It's got to be Abdul Fattah, Abdul Masih, Abdul Jabbar, Abdul Karim, Abdul whatever. Abdullah even, which means slave of God, slave of Allah. But you can't just say Abdul and then leave it at that. It's splitting a sentence midway through it and just not finishing it. So, okay, that's one element, Abd. And you'll see the same element in a Hebrew name that you know. If you've read the Old Testament, looked at it, you know there's a book called Obadiah. Well, that is Abd, Yah. Yah being the first part of the divine name Yahweh or Jehovah. He's the slave of Yahweh or Jehovah. Abdiyah, Obadiah. And so, you know, you've seen these. Okay, so another element is Abu, or a little less commonly, you don't see this as often, but Abu means father of, means mother of. You see it in the Bible, actually. Arabic and Hebrew are closely related. If someone is called Abimelech, Abi, my father, is king, Melech, okay? Abimelech. Abraham, you know, he's the father of multitudes, right? It's the same element. So Abu Yusuf would mean the father of Joseph, probably the name of the person's eldest son. Joseph's mother, Yusuf, might be called Yusuf. One of the most famous singers, well, certainly the most famous singer in the Arab world in the last 100 years, is a woman by the name of Kulthum. Another element that's used very commonly is ibn or bin, son of. So Osama bin Laden, of happy memory. But it's again related to Hebrew. Ben-Hur is the son of Hur. He's actually referred to that as that in the movie at one point, at least that I recall. But Ben means son. So Benjamin, right? Son of the right hand. In Arabic, still today, it would be Ibn Yamin, son of the right. Benjamin. And we have lots of names like that. In Jerusalem, one of the most famous shopping streets is Ben Yehuda Street. So, okay, so that might help you a little bit and with making sense of these names. All right, so let's move on. Oh no, sorry, I forgot I had other elements I want to tell you. You'll see a lot of names that end in I, and those are often what are called nisba adjectives. So Egypt in Arabic is Misr, or in colloquial Egyptian Arabic it's Masr. And so somebody will be known as Al-Masri, meaning the Egyptian. Compare it to the biblical Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim was the son of Ham, who settles Egypt, right? And so Mitzrayim comes to be a name for Egypt and Egyptians. It's even a dual. It may even suggest something of Upper and Lower Egypt, the two parts of Egypt that were united by the pharaohs. Al-Baghdadi, the one from Baghdad. Ad-Damashqi, the one from Damascus or Damascus. Al-Qudsi, the one from Jerusalem, which is called in Arabic Al-Quds, the holy place. They very rarely use the word Yerushalayim or any form of that, Urus Salima. They call it Al-Quds or Beit al-Maqdis, the house of holiness. It's a memory of the ancient temple. So a person from Al-Quds is Al-Qudsi. A person from Syria, a Suri. A person who's from Turkey is a Turki. A person from Morocco or the Maghreb, it's called, the place of the setting sun, is Al-Maghrabi. Al-Jazairi from Algeria, a Tunisi from Tunisia, and on and on and on and on. Al-Libi, the Libyan. That's the way it works in Arabic very commonly. And I remember a teacher that I had who he was a Catholic monk in Cairo, and he loved the fact that I was LDS. And we used to joke about it. He joked about it all the time. He'd bring in things like tea. He used to teach at UCLA, so he'd seen the temple a lot. He knew a little about Mormons. And he'd bring in tea, and he'd sip it in front of me and say, it was a one-on-one class, he'd say, oh, can you have any? No, you can't have any of this, can you? Or he'd bring in coffee. Oh, would you like some coffee? Oh, I'm sorry, you can't have any coffee. And one day he brought in a chocolate bar, Cadbury's. He said, can you eat Cadbury's? And I grabbed it and said, yes, I can. Anyway, years later, I saw him at a conference. He's passed away now, one of my favorite people. He saw me clear across the room and yelled out, El Mormoni. That's an adjective of that form, the Mormon. So he knew me as Abu Yusuf El Mormoni. My first son was named Joseph. Okay, so let's go back to history after that little linguistic excursus. I like names. 1954, the British begin to withdraw from Egypt. They take a long time. It takes a while. It's a 1936 treaty. You can tell they were not in a hurry to leave. And why did they not want to leave? Because of the Suez Canal. They thought that was really important. In 1955, Prime Minister Nasser, who will soon become President Nasser, begins to reorient Egypt away from the West. He claims to be neutral, but in fact he begins cozying up to the Soviet bloc. He buys arms from Czechoslovakia, a communist country, in order to re-equip his army after the embarrassing disaster of the 48 War. In 1956, in January, Egypt and Britain relinquished control of the Sudan. This is an important thing that the Sudan gets its independence. They had been ruling it since the end of the 19th century. If you've seen the movie Khartoum, you get some of the history of that, where they defeated the Mahdi, or where I should say the important incident where Charlton Heston defeats Sir Laurence Olivier in the movie Khartoum. And so things are changing gradually, but in 1956 you also have the Suez Canal crisis. And that's a really terrible affair in some ways. 1956, July. President Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. He wants to fund the Aswan High Dam. The British and the U.S. have withdrawn funding from it, seeing him moving toward the Soviet bloc. They're not happy with him. They don't want to help him out. So he nationalizes the canal. This is a really big deal. And so you have a war later that year in October and November where Britain and France and Israel join up together to launch a preemptive attack on Egypt to take the canal back. But it fails. Why does it fail? Because General Eisenhower, now President Eisenhower, intervenes, and he tells them, back off. And this is a really important event in British history as well as Egyptian history because for the first time Britain is realizing it is not a superpower anymore, nor is France. And so when Eisenhower says, back off and withdraw your troops, they're obliged to do it. It's a humiliation. The British government falls. And Nasser looks fantastic. I mean, after this 1948 disaster in 56, they have something of a success. In 1958, Nasser begins to really push the idea of pan-Arabism, pan-Arab unity. His goal is to unify all of the Arab world, as it once was, under Egyptian leadership. And so he's riding high. He's got prestige and so on. The only practical accomplishment here is that he manages to get Syria to join up in something he calls the United Arab Republic. But it only lasts for 3 years, 1958 to 1961. But Nasser is now head of, he's making steps toward pan-Arab unity, right? His descendant, by the way, later on will be Muammar al-Gaddafi, who wants to do the same thing. He's a pan-Arab nationalist, when Egypt has given up on the idea. But Nasser controls Syria, and there are a couple of stories that I get a kick out of from that period. One involves Nasser going to Syria and looking around for just a few days, and he comes out with a complaint. He says this country doesn't have enough bureaucrats to run a grocery store. Now, I think it's interesting that he thinks bureaucrats are necessary to run a grocery store. In fact, at least when I was living in Egypt, there were. You had to get things stamped and go to various lines, and you couldn't buy your own groceries. You had to have somebody following along holding the basket. Then you'd go get it, take care of things at one desk, and then we'd get a government stamp on it, that sort of thing, each time. It was ludicrous. But he saw the failure to have bureaucrats as a defect in Syria, thought they ought to have more. It says something about what has historically often been the Egyptian mindset. Egypt has long been, and you'll see it in the tomb paintings, a country ruled by a pharaoh with a huge bureaucratic staff of scribes beneath it. And then beneath them, the peasants working away in the fields. And the peasants are rooted to the soil. Syria, and Jordan even more so, these are kind of Bedouin countries in a way. And Bedouins are free. They can move away. If they're oppressed, they leave. There's nothing much you can do to them. And I remember once being out in the Sinai shortly after Egypt had taken control of it again, and I was standing for some reason, next to an Arab Bedouin guy sitting on a camel. Nobody else was around. I didn't know what to say, so I said something like, well, I bet you're happy to be under Egyptian rule again. And he looked at me kind of oddly, and said, I'm a Bedouin. By which I knew what he was saying. I don't care who runs this place. Israelis, Egyptians, it makes no difference to me. I ignore them all. I live on my own. I'm free. They can't tax me. They can't track me. There's nothing they can do. So Egypt and Syria didn't work together, and the idea of pan-Arabism failed. But that was significant. The United Arab Republic, right? During that period, Nasser is also adopting socialist policies. He's moving toward the Soviet Union. He admires them. He believes their claims of great economic success. Nationalization of industry. He does the same thing. Huge welfare program. He represses the Muslim Brotherhood and all the leftist movements. He doesn't want anybody to the left of him. He wants to boost the economy and make the government popular, but it doesn't really work. As you might well have predicted, nationalizing industry doesn't work. But I love what you can see in Egypt as examples of what the consequences of his economic policies were. To the south of Cairo, there's a town called Helwan. Helwan comes from the word helwa, which means sweet. There are sweetwater hot springs in Helwan, or there were, until Gamal Abdel Nasser thought that it would be better to build a concrete plant there because he wanted to industrialize. So he destroyed basically the resort areas, covered over the hot springs, and built these marvelous concrete plants, which were bigger than he needed. And you can still see them. They're basically lying unused. But they're surrounded by enormous walls, and at each corner is a machine gun emplacement, to guard the concrete, I guess. Which always struck me as weird because I grew up in a construction family, and we went to concrete plants all the time, cement plants. I didn't see any machine guns at any of them. You don't need machine guns to defend cement. But everything was militarized and socialized and so on there. But the example I like best is, and this was the lingering results of his socialist policies. Well, there are a couple of stories. They took over distribution of cheese. This is not my favorite story. I'll tell you two quickly, because, hey, I've got the lectern, right? I once was going to buy cheese. So you couldn't buy cheese of the kind we wanted in a regular grocery store. You had to go to the government cheese store. And so I went to the government cheese store, and I was waiting in line to get my cheese. And I heard giggling all around me. This is just after we'd arrived there. And then I looked up, and what's the deal? And well, I was standing, it turned out, in the women's cheese line, not the men's cheese line. So I was looking really ridiculous. I just, really? You have a men's cheese line and a women's cheese line for the government cheese store. But my favorite story was this. We lived right across the street from the American school in Mahdi, to the south of Cairo. And they were building a new building there, a new swimming pool, which I was really looking forward to. So there were construction trucks coming in all the time. A lot of activity going on. But one of the things they did, they kept dropping off sand shipments, dump truck loads of sand, right across the street from our apartment. And it was a hot summer. We stayed there in the summer that year, and we'd have our windows open. About 3 a.m, a concrete truck would come by and drop off a pile of construction sand. So I knew the headmaster of the school, and I asked him, what in the world is going on? Why can't they deliver this stuff at a decent hour of the day? It wakes us up. And he said, oh, you don't get it. This is government sand. This is sand, construction sand in Egypt is a government monopoly. And there's a 2 or 3 year waiting list. And so if you want to get your sand in a timely way, you bribe people. These are illegal nighttime sand shipments. And I remember thinking how remarkable it was that socialist economic planning in the Egyptian government had created a sand shortage in Egypt. I mean, that's astonishing. The country is 97% desert, right? But that's the amazing achievement of socialism right there. So it didn't work again. But in 1967, Nasser's feeling his oats. He again decides to try a military adventure against Israel. Egypt expels the UN buffer forces that were there in the Sinai between Israel and Egypt. It closes the Straits of Tiran, which are the way up into the Gulf of Aqaba, the Gulf of Eilat, the Israelis would call it, a principal outlet for Israeli shipping. Israel sees these as acts of war. Egypt signs a defense pact with Jordan, and Israel takes this as signs of preparation for war. So in June of 1967, Israel launches a preemptive strike, a rapid blitzkrieg kind of attack, and defeats Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, which leaves Israel greatly expanded. They now own the Golan Heights, and they still do. They own the West Bank. They still do. They own the Gaza Strip. Nobody really owns that anymore. They try to give it back to Egypt. Egypt doesn't want it. Because the Gaza Strip is the most densely populated place on the planet, and it's ungovernable. That's where Hamas is right now. But they also took the Sinai, and that eventually does go back under Sadat to Egypt. It's a tremendous humiliation, far worse than the 48 war. Just a disaster. It's called in Arabic the disaster when they refer to it. The Israelis call it the 6-day war. The Arabs would rather not refer to it that way. So it's just the disaster. And this discredits Nasser. He never really recovers. He has an emergency law go into effect. It suspends civil rights, remains in force for until really 2012. But he dies shortly thereafter. In 1970, in September, Nasser dies very suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 52 years old. Charismatic leader, had been really popular across the Arab world, but is kind of a broken man. He never recovers his leading role in the Arab states. Sadat comes to power. He's the vice president. He's little known. The American CIA promises that he will last only a month or two at most, and there's no reason to take him very seriously. Well, as George Bush would have said, they misunderestimated him. I think we have a picture here of Anwar Sadat. He becomes one of the most consequential, well, I would say the most consequential presidents of modern Egyptian history, and he's very well known and well liked in the Americas. Not everybody in Egypt felt the same way. They felt that he sold out to Israel and so on. But you'll find that our Egyptian guide Hani really admires him. He's a big fan. So here Sadat is shown with 4 different U.S. presidents. One of the signal achievements of his tenure is the completion of the Aswan High Dam. Here you see a satellite view of it, I believe. It was done with Soviet funding because the U.S. had backed out. This is kind of what the consequences of those great power politics were during the 50s and 60s. But the dam is finished, and it has a huge impact on irrigation, agriculture, industry. It provides hydroelectric power, and so on in Egypt. In 1971, Sadat changes the name of the country from the United Arab Republic, Syria having left it a decade before. He calls it the Arab Republic of Egypt. And this will indicate a new focus of his, which is, it's Egypt first. He used to say, the other Arab countries have wanted to fight Israel down to the last drop of Egyptian blood. He said, I'm not going to play this game anymore. In 1972, he expels the Soviet advisors who were there and reorients Egypt toward the West, undoing a lot of Nasser's policies. He launches an attempt, it didn't work very well, a lot of resistance, to open the economy to free market forces, to foreign investment. He wanted to attract foreign capital. In 1973, in October, he launches a war. He does. This is the so-called Ramadan War, if you're an Arab, the Yom Kippur War, if you're an Israeli. It's launched during a time of the high holy days. So that was not stupid. And he picks a time when the Israelis are probably at their most vulnerable, and he attacks with Syria to go to war against Israel to reclaim the land that they lost in 1967. Now, it wasn't a huge success. They did, though, cross forces into the Sinai, which was in some ways the first major victory that Egypt had had against the Israelis. And that's enough. In the end, the war ended when the Egyptians were probably going to lose. But they had stunned the Israelis and shocked them. Sadat later said he did this because it was a way of regaining prestige. He wanted to negotiate with Israel, but he couldn't do that from a position of humiliation. He had to do it from a position of strength where they would respect Egypt and not treat it as some kind of weakling. So in June of 1975, the Suez Canal was reopened. This is the first time since the Six-Day War in 1967. In 1977, Sadat, feeling, I think, that he could now do it, in October, he visits Israel. Some of you will remember this. I certainly do. It was one of the most dramatic things to ever happen in the Middle East. A lot of us thought this is unbelievable to see Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, addressing the Israeli Knesset and going to visit his erstwhile nemesis, Golda Meir, and joking with her and looking forward to peace. It began the process that led to the 1979 peace treaty and the return of the occupied Sinai Peninsula, and it also led to the suspension of Egypt from the Arab League for a long, long time, till 1989. And Egypt became a major beneficiary of U.S. financial aid, which it still is. His turn to the West, I think, was a wise one. He could see, I think, that the Soviet Union was a fading star, and that the only superpower that would remain would be the United States. In 1978, you had the Arab-Israeli peace accords. And that was where Sadat met with Menachem Begin and with Golda Meir and so on. You can see him here. Sadat with his arm extended and Begin to his left. But it was for this, sadly, that in 1981, October, Sadat was assassinated by Islamist militants, extremists who objected to his sellout to Israel, the great Zionist enemy, and they shot him. And I think he kind of knew that this might come. He was succeeded by his vice president, Hosni Mubarak. Hosni Mubarak was, at that time, a virtually unknown man. He'd been made the vice president of Egypt. He'd previously been the Minister of Defense, Deputy Minister of Defense, and the Air Marshal. But I can still remember that during that really tragic time when Sadat was killed, my wife and I were actually away from home. We were in Luxor at the time, and for a while we couldn't find out what had happened. Egyptian radio went silent, then it began playing military music, and we didn't hear for several hours that Sadat had been killed, and we didn't know if there had been a military coup in Cairo. It was impossible to get news. Probably would have been better if we'd been listening to the BBC, but Egyptian news was blacked out. Anyway, I still remember the time when I first heard Mubarak's voice. Very deep, surprisingly deep to me. I remember his opening lines. I don't remember anything else. He said, "Argu and tismahu li." I hope that you will permit me, to address you, he went on. But he was an unknown, and again, it was predicted that he would only last for a few months. Who was he? He was a nobody, but he lasted for a long, long time, too long, I think. He reimposed the state of emergency, which Sadat had briefly lifted. He restricted freedom of expression, political activity, and assembly, and then it went on that way for about 30 years. He was in power for a long, long time. But in January of 2011, you began to see anti-government demonstrations across the Arab world. It started in Tunisia against President Ben Ali there, but it soon spread to Egypt. This is what was called the Arab Spring. This is one of his official photographs as he was older. So in February of 2011, Hosni Mubarak stepped down. He handed power over to an army council, the army taking the role that the army has often occupied in the Middle East. The army is one of the most universally respected institutions in Egypt. People have a lot of respect for it because it's been seen to be above politics in a way. Same thing you see in Turkey sometimes, although the current Islamist regime in Turkey is damaging that. President Mubarak went on trial in August because he was charged with ordering the killing of demonstrators. And the demonstrations in Tahrir Square were very famous. Some of you saw scenes like this. Tahrir Square is not actually a square, it's round. But we call it a square in English. It's not called a square in Arabic. It's Maidan al-Tahrir. Maidan means a big open field. It's the same word that's used for the great and spacious field in Lehi's vision in the Arabic translation of the Book of Mormon. But this is what the demonstrations looked like, and I watched them just absolutely with fascination because Tahrir Square was my place where I hung out during much of my time in Egypt. The school that I attended, the American University, was at that time right on Tahrir Square, and so I was there almost every day. And I used to think, good grief, I know that shopkeeper, I know that shop, I know that place, I've been there, I've been in that restaurant. But there was a lot of hope in the Islamic world, the Arab world at the time, that things would get better. The army finally dispersed the demonstrators, and then the question was who would succeed. And the man who came to power on the basis of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that was a man by the name of Mohammed Morsi. There you see him. Mohammed Morsi was an Islamist. That is, he wanted to replace secular rule in Egypt with Islamist rule. A little surprising, some may think, given his background. He was U.S. educated. He had a PhD in engineering from USC. But he was very much an Islamist, representing the Muslim Brotherhood. So one of the things they did in December of 2012 was to draft a new constitution that would boost the role of Islam in the government and restrict freedom of speech and assembly. And so people began to protest against the new regime. As some of them said, we supported these demonstrations not to replace one tyrant with another. We didn't just want a change of names, we want a change of philosophy here. So in 2013, in July, the army overthrew Mohammed Morsi. There were huge demonstrations calling for him to quit, and he was forced out. Hundreds of people were killed. In 2013, in December, the government declared the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist group after they engaged in some terrorist activity. And then in January of 2014, the new constitution, yet another, banned political parties based on religion. So there went the Muslim Brotherhood, and they basically were forced into exile. So now, this is the current president of Egypt, Mohammed uh, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, but his first name is Muhammad. The most common name in the world is the name Muhammad. Almost every Muslim male has the name Muhammad, even if he doesn't use it, because if everyone used it, you wouldn't be able to tell anybody apart. But he wins the presidential election, and this is the man now who rules Egypt, and he does rule it with something of an iron fist. Egypt has never really had a functioning democracy. I think I'll show you something on his forehead, though. He has a little dark spot on his forehead. You can see it there. This is called a bisbis. And sometimes politicians really have it. Sometimes they have it artificially enhanced. It's where you touch your forehead to the ground when you pray. It's a visible sign that you are a devout Muslim. It's you're sending a message to your constituents and to voters and people like that. They can trust you. You're a devout. You pray regularly enough that there's a permanent callus on your forehead. So, yeah, it's using religion for politics. It may be genuine for all I know, but he too is, to an extent, Western educated. He received military training in the U.S. Now, in May of 2015, Mohamed Morsi, the previous deposed president, was sentenced to death because a lot of people had been killed under his rule. And he was sentenced along with 100 others to death, but he was not actually executed. In 2018, March of 2018, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi wins a second term. Most of the serious candidates had been removed from consideration. They were found ineligible to run. They were imprisoned for this or that campaign offense. And so, what do you know? Morsi won. Now, he may actually be fairly popular, though. And you could say that, well, Egypt is almost ungovernable as a democracy right now. Some people have said that. But okay, just to bring it really up to date, in June of 2019, Mohamed Morsi, that deposed president, did die in prison. He was 67 years old. And he's said to have died of natural causes, though we don't know. 25th of February 2020, Hosni Mubarak departed the scene, aged 91. So Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is the current president of Egypt. It's a military regime, effectively, even though he left the army and wears civilian clothes. I remember somebody objecting and saying it was just terrible that now the government was being dominated by the military in Egypt. And I said, oh yes, this is a really novel arrangement. It just happened. You know, have you forgotten about General Naguib and Colonel Nasser and Colonel Sadat and Colonel Mubarak? And now you have General al-Sisi. Wow, government rule in Egypt. What a shock. But it's the way it is. So anyway, that is a brief, maybe not brief enough, overview of the last 2,000 years of Egyptian history. There's a lot going on there, and I will say this, there is hardly a square foot of Egypt that is not historically significant. There is hardly a year in which Egypt is not interesting. It's interesting religiously, politically, culturally, in every way. It is in some ways one of the most fascinating countries on the planet, and so going there is a great opportunity. Greetings. We're going to be talking today about the last 2,000 years of Egyptian history. That's a lot of time to cover, so we'll just be hitting the headlines. Let me try that again. Hitting the headlights. All right. I'm starting to fall apart now.